Before I go on talking about bad maps again, I want to say something as a bit of an aside. I want to acknowledge the alternatives to level design. Random generation and procedural generation. Because why spend all that time designing a level when you can just get a computer to do it for you? Random generation is when the entire map is built up piece by piece completely randomly. Games like Minecraft, Terraria and Valheim all have randomly generated worlds, where no two worlds will ever be the same. They'll have rules behind their generation, like how in Terraria the underworld is always at the bottom of the map. But outside of these few parameters that the game sets for itself, the map can generate in a massive variety of ways. It's basically completely random. Then you've got procedural generation. Procedural generation is very similar, but instead of building up the map completely from scratch, the game will have certain tiles, rooms, or levels that are pre-designed that will get procedurally placed into the game at random. Games like The Binding of Isaac, A Risk of Rain 2, and Hades use procedural generation. As you can see, this style of world generation is very popular amongst games in the roguelike genre. Random and procedural generation are great for giving a game replayability. The game's less likely to get old because subsequent playthroughs feel like a super different experience because the world will be different. You're playing the same game, but each run will be different from the last. But I'm sure you can imagine that not every genre lends itself well to this style of map design. Heavily story-driven games might have a hard time convincingly placing their NPCs and boss fights into a world that will be completely different from one player to another. And making a balanced first-person shooter game with procedurally generated maps might be a difficult task to set yourself. But having said that, that doesn't make it impossible. A game called Htwo Process is a first-person shooter with procedurally generated levels, and it looks pretty fun from what I can see. I'm not sure how balanced it is, but hey, it's a very innovative concept nonetheless. Now you might think that this is just a downgrade to having someone meticulously design a level, but it can have its strengths to randomly generate your levels, and it can be a really good fit for certain genres. Sometimes, the best level design is no level design. Random generation is a little less common than procedural generation, because random generation completely builds the level from the ground up, which means that you can't pre-program enemy spawns or make an exciting set piece that you might want to have, or have super rigid skill curves that you might want to stick to. You instead have to rely on the rules that the world generation sets. Like in Valheim, despite what I personally thought of this game, one of the things that stood out to me as being really good was the world itself. It's visually very interesting and realistic looking, and it gives you the sense that you're going out and conquering the land. But because it's all randomly generated, there aren't really any preset spawn locations for enemies other than in a couple of the dungeons and stuff. So sometimes the game will just spawn in like a billion enemies at random, which causes abrupt difficulty spikes in certain places. Now, do I think Valheim should stop using randomly generated worlds? No, of course not. But it just goes to show that if you are going to do that sort of thing, you can't pre-plan where enemies are going to spawn, or how many of them there's going to be, or what types of enemies they're going to be, nearly as closely as you could with a pre-designed world. So if you are going to make a game with randomly generated worlds, then you need to put a lot of care and attention into your boss design, enemy design, and spawning algorithm to make sure that there aren't any random unforeseen difficulty spikes in the gameplay. But when we take a look at Random Generation's cooler older brother, we see that this issue doesn't really exist with that guy. Procedural Generation allows you to preset certain tiles, rooms, or maps in your game, and then build the world out of those preset tiles. Like in The Binding of Isaac. This room is pre-designed by the developers of the game. Where the enemies will spawn, what they will be, and where all the rocks and stuff are going to be is pre-designed by the developer's own hand. But this is just one of thousands of different room layouts that the game uses to generate a run. These rooms can be designed with the game's difficulty curve in mind. Harder rooms will only spawn on later floors, meaning you won't just die randomly to difficult enemies spawning in. The replay value that Random Generation gives you still remains, because the map is very different every time you play it. But Procedural Generation removes the downsides of not being able to meticulously balance your game's skill curve, because you can do that with procedural generation. So since we're going to be talking about level design in future videos, I just thought I'd make this little video to address the elephant in the room with that conversation. Because having your levels be generated by the game itself can be a great alternative for a lot of games, especially games that really need replay value to keep people invested. Because as good as pre-designed maps can be, a really good map generator in a game can make the levels feel so much more organic and original than any human designer could ever dream to make. Sometimes, the best level design is no level design at all. Thanks for watching.